second book is entitled Revivals and Other Great Events.
Yes, that's right. And this covers some of the other great moves of God over the last couple of 100 years or so. And one of those is a crusade taken by D.L. Moody. Now, he was a very powerful evangelist in the 19th century, whom God used up and down the land. And he was invited here in 1875 by a group of very wealthy businessmen. They got together, they formed a committee, and they decided to invite him. And as I say, he came in 1875. And what they did, they purchased a temporary building and they put it in a piece of wasteland in Victoria Street. Now, you see the picture coming up now. This will be recognised by most people. It's actually the council park that's in Victoria Street, and it's always been a waste piece of land ever since that crusade was held. Anyway, this building was designed to accommodate about 8,000 people. Now, there's next picture coming up is a building very similar to it, and that gives you an idea of the type of building it was. Now, as I said, it was designed to accommodate 8,000 people, but in actual fact, it accommodated a lot more than that, 10,000 or more. They didn't have the same health and safety concerns than they do have now. And the crusade was about a month in duration, and I would say that virtually every meeting was packed to capacity, with often a lot of people couldn't get into those meetings. So God's blessing was very much on that crusade. And I think one of the important factors was that they had prayer meetings each day at midday. And, you know, usually in these sort of events you get a small handful of people who will pray, but that wasn't the case then. There were literally thousands of people. They came together crying out to God for God's blessing on that crusade. And God doesn't disappoint. There was a tremendous move of God, something like 400 to 500 converts every meeting. And, you know, the effect on Liverpool was quite dramatic, particularly in the city centre. It was a talk of all the business community. Every day people were talking about what God was doing in this crusade. And also, at that time, there were 2 or 3 papers being issued in Liverpool, and they were based in the city centre. And with it being so close, they sent reporters, and it was well covered by the press. And it was actually headline stuff every day. That was the impact it had. So that was a very, very powerful crusade. Now, the amazing thing about it is that Moody, although God used him very powerfully, the man was really, he was not a great orator. He was just an ordinary man. But he was somebody who God took hold of. The important thing was he had God's anointing on him. And God just took hold of him and used him really powerfully. So there were thousands and thousands of people brought to Christ through that crusade. What I'd like to do is actually read a comment made by a Liverpool MP by the name of Samuel Smith, who was a very fine Christian, and he was on the committee that invited Moody. And this is what he said. "It has never been my lot to see so vast a crowd so deeply moved as those that filled the Victoria Hall night after night for more than a month. I have often listened to the eloquence of Gladstone and sometimes of John Bright, but neither of these orators could hold 8,000 to 10,000 people night after night, spellbound, as Mr. Moody did. And strange to say, he had no graces of eloquence, but an uncouth manner and an unmusical voice, and not a few Yankee mannerisms. But the evident sincerity, the tremendous earnestness, and the wondrous knowledge of the human heart and of God's remedy for sin made Mr. Moody's appeals irresistible." So we thank God that was a very powerful move of God, and here in Liverpool. Another one I'd like to refer to is one taken by a Liverpool businessman. He was a solicitor. He was a layman until the time of his death, but he was a man, even though he wasn't a great speaker by any means. And yes, God's hand was upon him, and he had a tremendous anointing on his ministry. And God used him in revival power up and down the land and even on the continent. It was said he was a chief human instrument that God used in the Aberdeen revival, where many thousands were brought into the kingdom. So this was a real powerful guy. But in 1855, God laid it on his heart to hire a building that used to be there called the Teutonic Hall, later the St. James's Hall. Now that was in Lime Street. Now you see the picture coming up on the screen now. That shows the approximate location. It was just on the other side of the road from Lime Street Station, just to the left. So you can see where that hall was located then. And so the idea was they were going to have meetings at half-hour intervals every Sunday. And before that, they had a very intense time of prayer and intercession right throughout the night. And prayer, as I've often found in all these moves of God and in every revival, prayer is always the key factor. And what I'd like to read is something which a comment his wife made about this, on this very subject. The watchword that sounded forth in those days was prayer. Praying always, with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit. It was another Pentecost, she said. The children of God waited, but with unceasing and united prayer for the promise. And its fulfillment came in manifested power from on high, that no flesh should glory in his presence. So, as I say, there was a huge amount of prayer went, and they trusted God to break in. And they were quite nervous on the first day, wondering whether the hall would be filled or not. And they came under a lot of criticism for the Christians. They didn't think it was a really good idea. It sounds very familiar. And but anyway, they started the meetings at 10 o'clock. And by 12 o'clock, God really broke through. The heavens were rent, and God came in tremendous power. People were crying out to God for mercy, and so many, they had to be moved into a separate room. There was a team of evangelists. They went out to different parts of the town. They held open air meetings and invited people to these meetings, and they led processions of people singing at the top of voices praises to God, and they came into the hall causing total disruption, but God was at work, and there were many people brought to the Lord. Now, Jane Ratcliffe, I believe it was, wrote in this way about those meetings, and this sums up what it was like. Never was there a more glorious sight than when those bands came marching in, their voices pealing over the town in praises to God. Prostitutes and drunkards, broken under the mighty power of God, were brought along with each company, all of which, joining at Lime Street, sang and filled the hall and streets. Jane Ratcliffe observed, never could those present forget the solemn effect of this. It was a scene never to be forgotten, as poor fallen women came from the dismal neighbourhood of Stanley Street to Thomas Buildings and Victoria Street, then a mass of tumble-down buildings, pigsties and haunts of vice. In they marched with shawls over their heads, dishevelled locks and burning cheeks, down which their tears were dropping. Preachers now began to address the people all around. Souls were crying out all day, some springing into liberty. Rich and poor alike were brought under the power of the gospel. Ladies in silk and satin dresses huddled up with poor ragged girls, men wearing gold chains and thieves down on their knees together, imploring pardons for their sins until midnight. Prior to that, somebody had a dream, and in the dream they saw rivers of water flowing through the city centre, and in the dream the word came, "This is revival." And that was just before those meetings, and a real powerful move of God broke out in those meetings. So that's two of the revivals I've written about in that booklet.
So far, everything you've told us has happened in Liverpool. What about the Wirral? Can you tell us anything about what God has done here?
Yes, he has indeed done many wonderful things. In the 1859 revival, which affected many parts of the country, as well as Wales, Ireland, both north and south, Liverpool was very much part of the centre of that revival, and at times many meetings were held at the same time, and one of them was in a building called Hope Hall, which picture is now coming up. A lot of people will recognise it. It's now the Everyman Theatre. So it's good to know that that building was actually part of revival many years ago. But the revival also affected different parts of the world. One of those areas was Brommerpool village, and a real move of God took place then. In that same village, later on, with the Price's Candle Factory, they had the owners were the two brothers, the Wilson brothers, and one of them was a fervent evangelical, and he had a real passion for the conversion of his workforce, and many of them were brought to a saving knowledge of the Lord through his speaking to them. And as they all lived in the village, they after a while they asked him whether they could build them a church for them, and that's exactly what he did. And that church is still there today. You can see this picture of Brommerpool village. You can see the church there, St Matthew's Church, that's still there and open today. In 1860, there was a real move of God in Claughton Village. A young man by the name of William Lockhart. He was only about 21 years of age. He was a well-known cricketer, actually, also. And God used him to bring a real move of God there. And he wrote in his diary about a great awakening had taken place in Claughton Village. In 1905, there was some real powerful moves of God also. Torrey and Alexander, they came round about that time, and they did a number of crusades in Liverpool and the world. And one meeting they took was in Port Sunlight in Hume Hall. And Mr. Lever closed the factory, and he had all his workforce coming to this meeting, so it was filled to thousands of people. And although there wasn't a great response to the invitation, something happened which brought a real move of God in that area, Port Sunlight, New Ferry, and particularly Rock Ferry. And God moved in a very powerful way. And this was not the secular press, the Christian press are reporting this. This was the secular press. The Birkenhead News carried weekly reports about what God was doing in Rock Ferry. And one of the places where God moved very powerfully was in St Paul's Road Mission, where we are today. And you can see the picture outside. This building is still has a church each week, functioning each week, and it's also used for a number of other Christian activities, including Flame Radio, which many people are aware of in Merseyside. Also at that time, during the middle of the Welsh revival, Evan Roberts, he had it laid on his heart to come to Merseyside. He believed God called him here. And he took a number of meetings in Liverpool and also in the Wirral, including 2 meetings in Birkenhead. And as a result of those meetings, a new church was formed and built, and you can see the picture of it now. It's in Laird Street in Birkenhead. And you know, the Welsh revival had tremendous press coverage. You know, if you look at the papers at that time, it was headline stuff every day, and virtually everybody knew about what was going on. And so when he came to Birkenhead, at the first meeting, there was three churches nominated where he may speak. And you know, when he came, every one of those buildings was packed to capacity, and with huge crowds outside. And the one that was eventually chosen was the Primitive Methodist Church in Grange Road, where Iceland is now. And it was right opposite Grange Baptist Church, which was then in Grange Road. So that was another great move of God. So yes, he's done some great things in Wirral also.
And what about Chester? It's been said that the Welsh revival stopped when it got as far as Chester. So have there been any great moves of God in Chester?
Yes, there have indeed. It is true what you said, but I think part of the reason for that maybe is because the Welsh revival was mainly affected Welsh-speaking people, but it was affected by other great revivals, such as the 1859 revival. Chester was also very much affected by that great revival. Prior to that, it was very much affected by the Methodist revival, with the frequent visits of John Wesley to Chester, something like 30 visits during the course of his ministry over nearly 40 years. And that was, well, we all know that the Methodist revival, sometimes known as the Second Great Awakening, and that affected many parts of the country, and Chester was very powerfully affected by that revival, as well as Liverpool, of course. And as I say, John Wesley came here 30 times. And, you know, the Methodist Church was not formed actually until after his death. So at that time, people used to go to the normal meetings on Sundays, and that the Methodist meetings were held at other times of the week, usually at 5 o'clock in the morning, where they'd have prayer meetings or Bible studies. And nowadays, maybe people wouldn't be so enthusiastic about attending meetings at that time, but then they did. It was huge enthusiasm, and vast crowds used to attend his meetings. And such was the enthusiasm that one young lady, she travelled from Neston to get to those meetings. That was 11 miles, so she'd travel 11 miles to get to the 5 o'clock meeting. So that, I think, is a real example to us today, you know, the sort of commitment they had. So, yes, a real powerful work was done through the Methodist revival. Prior to that, of course, there was the ministry of Matthew Henry. He was in Chester for 25 years, a great ministry under that man. And he actually married a girl from Bromborough, quite close to where I used to live, so I thought that's quite interesting. But I think one of the most powerful moves actually was in the 1880s under the Salvation Army. There's a young lady by the name of Marion Falconbridge, later Marion Pawson. She came to Chester, and she was what I would describe a fearless warrior for Christ, and God mightily used her. And at one time she actually came within an inch of losing her life, because as she led one of the processions through Chester, they were stoned, and she was very, very badly injured. But God raised her up, and she had the nickname the Zulu Queen. And you'll see coming on the screen now is a book that was written about her life under that title. And God really blessed her in Chester. You know, at that time there were a lot of empty buildings, skating rinks, and they used to be very popular, but they'd fallen out of fashion in the 1880s, and so there was a lot of empty buildings like that. And the Salvation Army took over quite a number of those buildings, including in Chester. And so she took over one, and it was filled to capacity, 3,000 people, but that wasn't big enough. Such was the move of God, you know, that she had to take on a second building. So something like 5,000-6,000 people were affected by the work of the Salvation Army in those days. So that was a real work of God also. There's another picture that's coming on your screen, and this is I got this from the War Cry, and it was a huge meeting held in the Chester Town Square, and you can see that the crowds, you know, that were in that meeting there. So to answer your question, yes, God has blessed Chester also very powerfully over the years.